to do with that. We're going to stay over here in our little doctrinal corner and just, you kind of kooky people speaking in tongues, you do your own thing. So that pushed them over farther into the doctrinal camp. They didn't really communicate with the charismatics of various, and there's some were very godly, some were completely right on, some were probably a little farther off the beaten path for our comfort, but there were some legitimate things going on there, but the fundamentalists kind of isolated themselves from having meaningful dialogue with the charismatic movement. Another movement going on early in the 1900s. Mary Baker Eddy, that's Christian Science, 1865, so that's a little earlier. We have the social gospel, which is basically saying, hey, let's take our, it's an outflow of theological liberalism that says, let's just focus on the ethics of Christianity and help the poor and help the needy and help the downtrodden. No, that's a good thing, as we're going to see soon, when we talk about Christian doctrines and practices. But in an overreaction, not that Christians would overreact, but in an overreaction, and you watch history, this is what happens. We swing one way, and then we swing the other way, and then we swing the other way. In an overreaction against the social movement, fundamentalism becomes very doctrine-oriented and kind of leaves out the whole Christian practice. What do we do with what we know? And this is where, any questions about that? I'm just going to kind of keep plugging through. If you have any questions, then raise your hand. The next section then, kind of
Matt, you said I could ask. I got one.
You said raising hands when we were talking about
Oh I thought you were just, go ahead.
So I was going to speak in tongues.
Yeah. Sounds great. No, that would be good.
Mormonism and the current environment, especially the election environment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're hearing some of this, I'm sure you are, that, there's something about Mormons and politics that's really interesting that's going on all over the country. But one of the things they are doing, they have a campaign to show that they are a Christian movement. They have TV ads.
Yes, I've seen some of those.
Yeah.
You see the billboards.
Yeah.
Worse, they're trying to set it normal. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And we know that's not normal. Yeah, they are trying to look mainstream, and you know what? They're going to use our lingo. They're going to look as evangelical as they possibly can to look like now they're mainstream. But again, this is why these kinds of things, these 5 fundamental doctrines, Trinity, this is why this is not just important, but critical. Because we say that this is a line. Not Nicaea, we're in this tent of Nicene Christianity. And if you don't believe that God the Son is as much God as God the Father is God, you can call yourself whatever you want, but you can't call yourself Christian. You have no right to do that. And that's what Mormonism does. So yeah, that's an interesting point. Did I cut you off? Did you want to say more about that?
No,
that's fascinating.
I think we're going to have to address that as a Christian community a little more than we have.
I think you're absolutely right. And the way we address it is by appealing back to basic Christian doctrine. We don't want to talk about eschatology with Mormons. We don't want to talk about, whether the archaeological record supports what they claim happened in, these Indian tribes. We don't care about any of that. It all comes back to authority in Scripture and the character and action and nature of Christ. That's all we need. So yeah, that's a good point. Eddie, did you have something else?
Yeah, do you equate the charismatic movement at all to the ecstatic utterance that was prevalent among many of the early religions had the equivalent of what our charismatic movement? And I'm talking 2,000 years ago.
And throughout church history, you're going to find mystical strains of Catholicism that do the same thing. That if you were to look at a medieval mystic Catholic, they would look a lot like a modern charismatic person. So yeah, this thing kind of keeps coming up. Yeah, I think it's the exact same thing. Structurally, theologically, it's just another reiteration of the same issue. So yeah, that's a good point. It keeps coming up, and we don't deal with some of it as definitively as we could, or as unitedly as we could. Yes, ma'am.
The charismatic movement was very separate for a long time. What brought it back into the mainstream churches I'd say, I became aware of it. I'd never heard of speaking in tongues like they claim, until maybe the late 60s or early 70s when it hit the little town I was in. What do you think brought it back?
The very next thing we're going to talk about, which is evangelicalism. Evangelicalism wants to minimize doctrinal distinctives and popularize generic Christianity for everybody. And it makes everybody feel welcome. The Calvinist, the Arminian, the charismatic, the kind of stuffy old, Presbyterian guy sitting in the corner. Evangelicalism is very, very inclusive, and I think it's very ironic that you're saying that's 1960s. Is that kind of? That's about when evangelicalism is really picking up a lot of steam. It's not ecumenicism, but there are some parallels structurally there, and I think that's what it is. Evangelicalism wants to say, hey, let's just all get along. And we'll talk about evangelicalism in just a minute, and I think you'll see that. But I think that's really the force that, hey, let's all get along, let's all get together. We're all on the same page, aren't we? We're all on the same side. Yeah, and some of us are, and some of us aren't. So that's a good point. Yes, ma'am.
My question is, do you think that the evangelical movement that you're talking, evangelicalism, laid the foundation for the acceptance of the postmodern thought of, Buddha is the way to God, and, Hindu is the way to God, all of them, or did it give birth to that postmodern thought?
Evangelicalism is much more tolerant than fundamentalism, as we'll see in just a few minutes here. But I think that other stuff is slipping in through other cracks in the culture, not through the church, but through increased interaction with other internationally, increased interaction globally with other people groups. I think that's where it's coming in, but a failure to speak out as decisively against it as we should have is more an evangelical trait than it is a fundamentalist trait. Okay, fundamentalists would have beat the thing senseless and left it on the side of the street to die. Evangelicalism is going to be a little nicer with it and maybe too nice, and not deal with things as definitively as it should. Okay, let's jump into stabilization. How does the fundamentalism is it's almost so exclusivistic that it almost shoots itself in the foot. And after a while, you have the next generation that says, hey, wait a minute, what about, okay, you're so doctrine heavy, what about all the Christian practice? What about the things we're supposed to do as Christians based on this doctrinal foundation? So that's what evangelicalism does. It is going to say, we buy the doctrinal thing. We're there. We're totally there with you. But we've got to do something with that. So I'm kind of generically putting 1930 to 1990. I'm not going to die in the state for any of these days, but that's kind of the basically the idea. They attempt to balance the doctrinal-heavy approach with Christian practice. We have a couple verses. We'll go back to those verses in Titus a little bit later on, and it's good what they're trying to do. The problem is, if you move the spotlight onto one thing, you take it off of something else. If you move the spotlight off of our need to draw these doctrinal lines in the sand, if you take it off the doctrines, or if you put it on the practice, you take it off the doctrine. And evangelicalism is so anxious to get out there and get people saved, to focus on practice, to realize, yes, we should be doing something socially. There should be some expression of Christianity where we're helping the poor and the needy. It's so anxious to do those things that the doctrinal thing gets a little flimsy. and we kind of go off those moorings a little bit, especially with the focus on mass evangelism. And, you know, culturally, what else is going on in the 1930s, 40s? You have radio, you have TV, you have all, you know, all this mass media, and they say, hey, this is great, we're just going to open this door wide open and just get the gospel out there, and that's a great thing. The problem is how effective is that mass evangelism, and more importantly is how doctrinally faithful is that mass evangelism. When it kind of becomes hey, you know, just go off the island and get saved, then now we're losing some of our Christian identity, our Christian foundation, because we're not emphasizing those doctrines as much. And I know that's a horrible broad stroke, I don't mean it to be, but I'm just saying in a broad sense that's what evangelicalism is. It's a swinging back over to this side, and we're kind of minimizing the doctrinal side a little bit. I'm going to, just kind of to explain this, I'm going to give a little report card. And by the way, that's supposed to be a report card on evangelicalism on your sheet, not on evangelism. I'm very much for evangelism. So I'm going to give a little report card on how evangelicalism does in terms of maintaining doctrine. What happened with fundamentalism is it became very stuffy and very condescending. Because it's kind of like, here's our line in the sand, you know, we're over here and we're right and you're wrong. So unfortunately, fundamentalism had kind of taken on a very condescending tone, and evangelicalism wants to fix that. And then what about highlighting evangelism? How do we do? And I'm saying we because we're grading ourselves. We're kind of here in the, you know, I say I'm a fundamentalist, I say I'm evangelical. You know, this is a self-assessment as much as it is kind of a broad movement assessment. Maintaining doctrine, sorry guys, I got to give us about a C+. So focused on getting this very, very basic, watered-down gospel out there that we really end up minimizing our essential Christian doctrine. And we make people who want to focus on essential Christian doctrine look like bad guys. Look like, oh, you're just a stick in the mud. You know, we're trying to move forward here, get the whole world saved. And you're holding us back with all your doctrinal talk.
Are you going to name names? Who is we?
We are we. No, I wasn't going to name names.
C plus.
Did you have anybody in mind? I mean, other than me? Did you have anybody? Who are you thinking about?
Well, if you think of the evangelical movements, I think of them in my history. One of my heroes is Billy Graham, of course. And then the Campus Crusade, I have roots in Campus Crusade. Another. In fact, I saw a Josh McDowell book out on the table as I came in.
Yes. And you know, I think Campus Crusade does as good as many of these groups in terms of trying to maintain both the doctrinal balance with the practice, with the evangelical, evangelism emphasis.
But now those are groups. Are you going to talk, if you pick a church, pick a Methodist church. This is Baptist, right?
Something like that. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the thing. You'd have to grade these. Got all kinds of sentences out there. Yeah, you'd have to grade an individual. I'm just being really, really broad here, and saying we kind of missed this. We weren't able to, and I'm saying we, because you know, we're all part of this, I think. And we can look at Billy Graham or we can look at this church or whatever, but it really is, you know, the movement as a whole, in so focusing over this way, kind of forgot this, the doctrinal element.
And two, that it sends a real mixed message to these new believers as to what it means to be a Christian.
That's absolutely true.
You know, there is like, okay, am I supposed to be Billy Graham? Am I supposed to be Charles Stanley? Am I supposed to be the Purpose-Driven Church? Where, you know, because it's so all over the place, not a standard of what it means to be a Christian. It's like you've sold them fire insurance and everyone's houses is eaten up with termites.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, it's like, great, you have fire insurance, but you need a termite inspection.
Yes, yes. And